The Road to Civitat. A Marcher's Account, Spring 1096. The road opens. I cannot say precisely when I ceased to be a man of the village and became a man of the road. Perhaps it was the morning Father Bernard climbed onto the market cross at Spire and told us that the Holy Sepulchre cried out for liberation, that Christ himself had appeared to men in visions, promising remission of all sins. Perhaps it was earlier, when my brother's fever took him in the winter and left me with half a field and a debt to the monastery I could never repay. Or perhaps it was simply that moment when I saw the first banners moving south along the river path, crude white crosses sewn onto old cloaks, and knew that staying behind would mean staying forever. The crowds came from everywhere in those spring weeks. Not armies. Not in any way I understood an army should look. Families with children perched on carts piled high with blankets and sacks of rye. Old men who could barely walk but insisted they would see Jerusalem before they died. A few minor knights, their mail shirts patched and their horses lean, trying to maintain some order that melted away by midday. Women, so many women, some following husbands, others alone with infants wrapped against the morning chill. And preachers, everywhere preachers, each one claiming to have the true route, the true message, the true blessing. I joined a company forming behind a banner that showed a rough lamb painted on old linen. The man who carried it, Gerard, had been a shepherd near Trier and claimed he had seen the lamb bleed real blood in a dream. Whether that was true or not, the banner gave us something to follow. We numbered perhaps 200 when we left the fields behind Spire, but that number shifted daily. People would drift away to join another group they heard had a knight with connections in Hungary, or because they quarreled over who should guard the single tent we shared, or simply because they grew tired of Gerard's endless prayers. My cart, I cannot quite bring myself to call it mine alone, since I shared it with 5 others, had wheels that squeaked abominably and a left axle that needed greasing every few miles. We had loaded it with what little we possessed: 3 sacks of coarse rye flour, a barrel of salted pork that was more salt than pork, 2 goat skins for water, and a collection of tools, blankets, and cooking pots that rattled with every bump. I had traded my good knife and my father's all for a spear, a weapon I had never held in anger and barely knew how to carry without striking someone accidentally as we jostled along the path. The road south along the Rhine was not truly a road in many places, merely a track worn by traders and pack animals, now swollen with thousands of feet. Dust rose in choking clouds when the weather held, and when rain came, as it did frequently that spring, the path became a river of mud that sucked at cartwheels and made every mile a battle. The carts of those with money moved ahead, pulled by oxen or sturdy horses. The rest of us heaved and pushed, often putting our shoulders to wheels buried axle-deep in muck. Markets in the river towns swelled and then shuddered at our approach. In the first week, the sight of us was still novel enough that merchants would come out to trade. I remember a baker in a village whose name I never learned, standing in his doorway with loaves stacked on boards, calling out prices in local coin I did not recognize. A woman from our company, Mathilde, who wore a pilgrim shell already, though we had barely begun, tried to negotiate with him in a mixture of her dialect and his, holding up fingers to count, until at last they agreed on a weight of bread for a weight of silver pennies that no one was certain were fairly measured. The bread was dark and sour, but we ate it with joy, sitting by the river as the carts rolled past. But by the time we reached Worms in late May, the markets had learned to fear us. Or perhaps not us specifically, but the great unwashed torrent we had become. I heard there were 20,000 on the road by then, perhaps more. Numbers lost meaning. You could walk all day and never reach the front of the column, never see where the banners actually led. At night the campfires stretched along the river like fallen stars, and the sound of prayers and arguments and crying children merged into a single voice that echoed off the valley walls. May to June 1096. The Rhine Valley Worms was where everything changed, though I did not understand it at the time. We arrived at the town walls in the late afternoon, the sun heavy and warm, the air thick with river smell and the smoke of cooking fires. The gates were closed. That in itself was not unusual. Towns did not relish the thought of thousands of pilgrims flooding through their streets, but there was something else in the air, a tension that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Groups of men, not from our company but from others ahead of us, were gathered near the walls, and I could hear shouting, though I could not make out the words. Gerard wanted to move on, to find a place downstream to camp, but the press of people behind us made it impossible to turn the cart. We were stuck, part of the great jam of humanity that now stretched from the town walls back along the river path, farther than I could see. Someone started a fire. Someone else produced a skin of wine that had gone halfway to vinegar. We settled in to wait, though for what I was not certain. The shouting grew louder as evening came on. I climbed onto our cart to see better and glimpsed men in rough armor. Not knights, just men with whatever metal they could find, hammering at a door set in the wall away from the main gate. There were German words I recognized, and Latin words from liturgy twisted into something that sounded like curses. Then I saw the smoke rising from somewhere inside the walls, thin and dark against the darkening sky. "What are they doing?" Matilda asked from below. Her voice was quiet, uncertain. "I do not know," I said, which was true and not true. I did not know exactly what was happening, but I could feel it in my gut, the same feeling I had once when I saw a dog corner a cat in an alley. The violence that comes when something helpless is found by something that has been told it may act without consequence. By morning the smoke was thicker, and the shouting had turned to wailing. People came out of Worms, but they were not the people who had lived there. Or rather, they were some of those people, carrying what they could, fleeing toward the river. Behind them came others from our pilgrimage, carrying things they had not owned the day before. I saw one man struggling with a brass candlestick taller than himself, another with an armful of cloth that might have been vestments. A woman passed our cart, leading a mule that pulled a small wagon filled with scrolls, and when she saw us looking, she shouted something in German about heretics and Christ-killers, and how we should join them if we wanted God's favor. Gerard made us stay at the cart. "This is not our purpose," he said, his voice hard. "We are going to Jerusalem, not turning aside for plunder." But others from our company slipped away, drawn by the chaos and the promise of easy goods. 2 of them came back by midday with a bag of coins they claimed to have found in an abandoned house, though the blood on one man's sleeve suggested a different story. They tried to hide the coins in our provision barrel, but Gerard found them and threw them into the river, which led to an argument that nearly came to blows before an actual night. One of the minor nobles who sometimes rode along the column separated them with the flat of his sword and threats of worse. We moved on that afternoon, pushing past Worms without ever entering the town. The smell followed us for miles. Smoke and something else, something I had smelled once when a barn burned with animals still inside. I tried not to think about what we were leaving behind. Mine's was worse. We reached it in early June, and this time there was no pretense of order. Part of the pilgrimage had already passed through, or rather, had passed through it like a flood, leaving destruction in its wake. The Jewish quarter, which someone told me was near the cathedral, had been torn open. I did not see it myself. Gerard kept us moving on the road outside the walls, determined to stay clear of whatever madness had taken hold. But the stories came back with those who had gone in, stories of doors broken down, of people pulled from cellars where they had hidden, of choices offered that were no choices at all, stories of some townspeople trying to protect their neighbors, and others joining the violence with enthusiasm. I remember one man, not from our company but from another group camped nearby, sitting by his fire that night and weeping. Not from sorrow, but from some terrible ecstasy. He kept saying he had seen the Jews killed, and that it was right, that they had killed Christ and deserved death. But his hands shook so badly he could not hold his cup. His wife sat beside him, silent and gray-faced, and when I looked at her, she turned away. These were not battles. These were not the glorious struggles against the infidel that the preachers spoke of in their sermons. These were the kinds of violence men do when they are told they are righteous and given permission to harm those who cannot fight back. I knew it in my bones, though I could not have said why at the time. Perhaps because I had once seen a tax collector beaten by villagers who claimed he was stealing, though everyone knew he was merely doing what the Lord had ordered. The righteousness that justifies cruelty is a bitter thing, and it leaves a taste in the mouth like spoiled meat. We moved on from mines as quickly as we could, following the river south and then east, chasing the promise of Hungary and the road to Constantinople. Behind us, the Rhine Valley smoked and mourned. Ahead, the mountains rose blue and distant, and we told ourselves that once we left the German lands behind, once we crossed into the Empire's territories, things would be different. We told ourselves many things in those days. July-August 1096. The road through Hungary. The Hungarian king had given permission for passage, or so the word came down the column. We would be escorted, supplied at set points, ferried across rivers by imperial arrangement. All we had to do was follow the rules, stay on the roads, not forage beyond what was permitted. It sounded simple. It was not. The first escort met us at the border, a company of Hungarian cavalry who looked at our ragged mass with expressions somewhere between contempt and alarm. Their captain, a man with a drooping mustache and armor that actually fit, spoke Latin with a thick accent and made it clear through gestures and repeated words that we were to stay together, move at the pace he set, and not stray from the designated path. Any man caught pillaging or troubling the local villages would be hanged. He seemed quite serious about this. For a few days it worked. The road was better here, properly maintained, and our cart actually rolled without constant repair. The Hungarian countryside was green and prosperous, fields of wheat stretching to low hills, villages with good timber houses, and churches with painted domes. The locals watched us pass with wary eyes, but they came out to trade at the places the escort allowed, and the prices, once we worked out the confusion of currency, were not worse than we might have expected. The currency confusion was constant and maddening. I had silver pennies from 3 different lords, none of whom were recognized here. The Hungarians wanted their own coins, or failing that, goods of known weight. I spent half an hour once trying to trade a quarter sack of rye flour for bread, holding up handfuls of grain while a baker's wife shook her head and countered with amounts that seemed to shrink each time she weighed them. Eventually, we agreed on something. I still am not certain who got the better of that bargain, but the process left me exhausted and angry in a way that had nothing to do with the trade itself and everything to do with the slow grinding down of dignity that came with being a beggar in a foreign land. The heat began in earnest as July wore on. The sun beat down on the road until the dust shimmered, and the air felt thick enough to chew. We started moving earlier, trying to cover ground before midday, but the press of thousands of pilgrims meant we moved at the pace of the slowest cart, the weakest child, the oldest grandmother who refused to be left behind. Water became everything. The escort rationed access to wells and streams, allowing each company a set time to fill their skins before moving the mass onward. Fights broke out over water rights, over who had pushed ahead in line, over skins that leaked and barrels that turned green with algae. I developed a system. Fill the skins at dawn, bury them under the provisions in the cart to keep them cool, dole out water by the mouthful throughout the day. Gerard led prayers before each drink, as if the water were communion wine. Perhaps in a way it was the thing that kept us alive, that we shared equally among ourselves, even when others tried to hoard or steal. Matilda became our guardian of the water skins, and she guarded them fiercely, sleeping with her hand on the largest one, ready to cry out if anyone tried to sneak a drink in the night. The fever started in the 2nd week. Not the dramatic plagues of Scripture, but the slow burning kind that came from bad water, spoiled food, and exhaustion. People would wake in the morning complaining of headache and chills, and by evening they were lying in the back of carts, skin hot and dry, muttering to themselves. Some recovered after a few days of rest we could not really afford to give them. Others did not. I remember a boy, perhaps 10 years old, whose family was traveling a few carts ahead of us. He fell ill on a Wednesday. I know because Gerard marked the days carefully in a stick he notched each evening. By Friday, the boy could not stand. His father carried him for a while, but we were moving too slowly and the escort was pushing us harder to reach the next station before dark. On Saturday morning, the cart that carried the boy was lighter. His parents walked behind it, neither speaking, their faces as empty as broken pots. The escort insisted we bury our dead quickly and mark the graves with crosses so other pilgrims would know Christians lay there. But the graves were shallow, the ground was hard, and we had few proper tools, and I sometimes wondered what would happen when the next rain came or when wild animals found the scent. Better not to think of it, better to focus on the road ahead, on the daily routine of walking, eating, praying, sleeping, and then walking again. We crossed into Bulgaria in early August. The escort changed. Byzantine soldiers now instead of Hungarian, their armor more uniform, their discipline tighter. They seemed less interested in whether we lived or died, and more interested in moving us through their territory as quickly as possible. The rationing became stricter. At each station we were given bread, dark coarse loaves that weighed exactly 3 pounds by the Byzantine scale, though Gerard swore they were lighter than they should be, and a measure of wine so sour it made your teeth ache. The wine was more water than wine anyway, but it was wet, and it kept some of the fevers at bay, or so we told ourselves. The Bulgarian villages were poorer than the Hungarian ones, or perhaps they had just been more thoroughly picked over by earlier waves of pilgrims. The locals no longer came out to trade. They watched from doorways and shuttered windows, and if anyone strayed from the road toward their fields, men with axes and hoes would appear to drive them back. Our escort did not interfere with this. They seemed to think it was fair. One night we camped near a village whose name I never learned, and someone from a different company decided to steal chickens from a barn on the edge of town. The villagers caught him and beat him badly before our escort intervened. The Byzantine officer in charge called the entire pilgrimage together the next morning and had the thief tied to a post in the center of camp. He explained through an interpreter whose Latin was better than mine that stealing from imperial subjects was a crime against the emperor himself, and that the punishment was 40 lashes or expulsion from the pilgrimage. The man chose the lashes. We all stood and watched while a soldier administered them, counting each stroke in Greek. The man screamed, and then stopped screaming, and then hung silent against the post. They cut him down and gave him to his companions, and we moved on an hour later. I do not know if he lived. I do not know if it mattered. The road ground on. The heat continued. Carts broke down and were abandoned, their contents distributed among those who could still carry more. Arguments became fistfights became blood feuds that the escorts had to separate with drawn swords. A woman gave birth in the back of a cart one morning, and by evening both she and the child were dead, and we buried them together in a shallow grave by the side of the road. 2 men deserted one night, slipping away into the darkness, choosing to take their chances in the wilderness rather than continue with us toward Constantinople. I understood the impulse. September 1096. Outside Constantinople, we saw the walls long before we reached them. They rose across the horizon like mountains made by men, stone on impossible stone, towers and battlements that seemed to scrape the sky. I had heard of Constantinople, of course. Every Christian knew it was the greatest city in the world, the seat of the Eastern Emperor, the place where ancient Rome still lived in marble and gold. But hearing and seeing are different things, and the first sight of those walls struck me silent with an awe that was close to fear. Gerard wept. "The city of Constantine," he whispered. "We have walked from the Rhine to the edge of paradise." "It is not paradise," Matilda said, practical as always. "It is a city. They will have food there and rules and people who think we are barbarians." She was right, of course, but in that moment, staring at those walls with the sun breaking over them in sheets of gold, I let myself believe we had reached something holy. that the road's end was in sight, that Jerusalem itself might look like this, grand and glorious and worth every mile of dust and fever and death. We camped outside the walls, not directly against them, but in a sprawling mess of thousands of pilgrims spread across the fields and low hills of the Thracian plain. The Byzantine authorities had set up a system, or tried to, designated areas for each company, regular distributions of bread and wine, guards to prevent anyone from slipping into the city without permission. The reality was chaos. Companies mixed and merged and split apart. People wandered, searching for friends or family they had lost along the road, or simply drawn by rumors of better rations elsewhere in the camp. The smell of latrines overwhelmed any attempt at organization. Greek officers moved through the camp, speaking through interpreters, trying to impose discipline on a mass of people who had left discipline behind in the Rhineland. They confiscated weapons from those who looked dangerous, noting each man's name and company in wax tablets they carried. They broke up fights with efficiency that suggested long practice at dealing with unruly foreigners. And they made it very clear that Constantinople itself was close to us. Entry was by permission only in small groups for limited purposes. The city's markets did come to us, though. Merchants set up stalls just outside the camp's edge, selling everything imaginable. Bread that was white and soft and nothing like the coarse loaves we had been eating for months. Wine that was actually wine and not vinegar. Fruits I did not recognize. Spices that made my eyes water. Cloth, weapons, tools, small relics of dubious authenticity. And the prices. By God, the prices. Everything was quoted in Byzantine numismata, gold coins that seemed impossibly valuable, or in smaller silver and copper coins whose relationship to each other, and to the currencies we carried, was impossible to calculate. I watched a knight from a wealthier company try to buy a sword. The merchant wanted 2 numismata. The knight offered silver pennies, a whole handful of them. The merchant weighed them, bit one, shook his head. The interpreter explained something about purity and debasement. The knight shouted. The merchant shrugged. Eventually they agreed on some exchange rate that left the knight red-faced, and the merchant pleased, and the sword changed hands. I suspected the knight had been cheated, but I had no way to know. Our company stayed together, more or less, in a patch of ground that turned to mud when it rained, and to dust when it did not. We supplemented our rations by trading at the markets, though we had little left to trade. I sold my spare cloak for a string of copper coins that bought us one good meal of roasted lamb, and the memory of that taste, meat that was not salted to leather, fat that ran down my chin, bread to soak up the juices, stayed with me for days afterward. The city itself remained closed to us except for carefully controlled visits to certain churches. I went once part of a group of 50 escorted by guards who watched us like we might steal the mosaics off the walls. The church, I think it was called Theotokos, or perhaps that was just the name of Mary they used, was beyond anything I had imagined. Walls covered in golden images of saints and emperors, marble columns thick as 3 men, candles burning by the hundreds, and a smell of incense so rich it made me dizzy. We were allowed to pray for a quarter hour, and then we were ushered out and marched back to camp. That night Gerard preached to anyone who would listen about the glory we had seen and the greater glory that awaited us in Jerusalem. If the Greeks can build such churches to God's mother, he said, imagine what the Holy Sepulchre must be like. Imagine seeing the place where Christ himself rose from death. I tried to imagine it, but mostly I thought about the march ahead, the mountains we would have to cross, the Turks who held the lands between us and Jerusalem. The road that had brought us this far had been hard enough. The road ahead would be worse. Early October 1096, across the Bosporus, the ferrying began at the end of September. Byzantine boats, sturdy craft with square sails and crews who shouted in Greek, carried us in batches across the straits to the Asian shore. Each crossing took perhaps an hour, the water surprisingly blue and the wind cold despite the season. I stood at the rail, There was no rail, actually, just the side of the boat, rough wood that left splinters in my palm, and watched Constantinople recede behind us, while ahead the hills of Asia rose green and uncertain. The Asian camp was worse than the European one. The ground was rockier, the water supply more limited, the sense of being at the edge of enemy territory more acute. Greek guides told us to stay close, not to wander, that the Turks raided regularly and would kill stragglers without mercy. But they also told us that the fertile lands around Nicaea, just a few days' march inland, were lightly defended and full of provisions, villages that could be taken easily, livestock just waiting to be seized. Whether the guides actually said this, or whether it was wishful thinking passed from company to company until it became accepted fact, I cannot say. But by the time we had all crossed and settled into the camp, the mood had shifted from cautious to confident. We had survived the road from the Rhine. We had outlasted hunger and fever and brutal escorts. We had seen the walls of Constantinople and been unimpressed with Greek discipline. Surely we could handle a few Turkish raiders. Foraging parties went out daily, pushing farther from camp, returning with stolen grain and goats and stories of villages abandoned at their approach. Each success fed the next expedition. Companies began competing, boasting about how far they had ranged, how much they had taken. The few nobles who had come with us tried to impose some order, but they were outnumbered and mostly ignored. I went out once with Gerard and a dozen others, following a track that wound through scrubby hills toward a cluster of buildings someone said was a Turkish farm. We found it abandoned, the people fled or hidden, and we took what we could carry: a sack of grain, some dried meat, a goat that bleated pathetically as we dragged it back to camp. I felt like a thief, which I suppose I was, but I also felt the thrill of it, the sense that we were taking from the enemy, that this was righteous plunder in service of God's war. The night we roasted that goat, sharing the meat among our company while the fat dripped and sizzled in the fire, Gerard stood and declared that we would march on Nicaea itself. Others around us cheered. Someone started singing a hymn that turned into a marching song. Wine went around. Real wine this time, not the sour rations, but something we had traded for with our plunder. Matilda sat beside me, her face lit by firelight, and said quietly, "This is a mistake." "We have to eat," I said. "We could wait for the Emperor's army. They said it was coming, that we should hold here until the true Crusade arrived." "The Emperor's army could be months away. We will starve by then. We will die if we march on Nicaea with nothing but courage and stolen goats." She was right. I knew she was right. But I was tired of waiting, tired of being hungry, tired of watching people die from disease and exhaustion when enemy wealth lay just out of reach. So when Gerard asked who would march at dawn, I raised my hand with the others. October 21st, 1096, the road to Civitate. We left before first light, perhaps 6,000 of us, maybe more. It was hard to count in the darkness. Harder still to maintain any formation as we spread out along the track. The few knights rode ahead, their armor rattling, while the rest of us walked behind with whatever weapons we had managed to keep or steal or make. I carried my spear and a knife tucked in my belt. Others had swords, axes, clubs, farming tools sharpened to points. One man brought a scythe and carried it over his shoulder like some grim reaper. The dawn came up red and beautiful, which someone said was a good omen. We prayed as we walked, Gerard leading us in the Pater Noster, the words floating back along the column. The land around us was empty and silent, just scrub brush and rocky outcrops and the occasional abandoned farm. The track wound through low hills, sometimes dipping into wooded hollows, where the trees grew thick enough to block the rising sun. We were in one of these hollows when the arrows came. I did not see the first one. I heard it, a sound like a sharp breath, and then a cry somewhere ahead. Then another arrow, and another, coming from the trees on both sides of the track. The column lurched, men shouting, trying to see where the attack was coming from. I raised my spear uselessly, searching the shadows under the trees for targets that I could not find. The arrows kept coming, a steady rain of them, and men were falling. Not dramatically, not like in songs where heroes take arrows and keep fighting. Just falling, clutching at shafts buried in shoulders, and legs and faces, making sounds that were not quite screams. The column broke. Some men rushed forward, toward where they thought the enemy must be. Others turned to run back the way we had come. Most just milled in confusion. Shields raised if they had shields, exposed if they did not. I saw a knight try to organize a charge, spurring his horse toward the trees. The horse went down with an arrow in its throat, pitching him forward. He tried to stand in his armor and took 3 arrows before he fell again. The men who had been following him scattered. The Turks came out of the trees then. Not the massive force I had imagined, but groups of cavalry, swift and controlled, firing from horseback, and then wheeling away before we could close with them. They wore light armor, leather and mail, and they moved like water around stone, hitting us from one side and then the other, never staying still long enough to be struck. We ran. I am not proud of it, but there is no other word. The column dissolved into a mob of panicked men, fleeing back along the track, abandoning carts and weapons and each other. The Turks followed, harrying us, cutting down the slow and the wounded. I saw Gerard fall, an arrow in his back, and I did not stop. I saw Mathilde stumble, and I did not stop. I ran with my spear still in my hand, until my lungs burned, and my legs went numb, ran until the only sound was my own gasping and the thunder of my heart. The track opened onto a wider plain, and ahead I could see the ruins of some old fort. "Civitate," someone was shouting. "Get to Civitate." Hundreds of us poured toward it, thinking the walls would offer protection. But the fort was half collapsed, its gates missing, its walls broken in a dozen places. We crowded inside anyway, pressed together in a space meant for a fraction of our number, while outside the Turkish arrows continued to fall. Some men tried to fight. They climbed the broken walls and threw stones, shot back with what few bows we had. Most just cowered and prayed. I was among the latter, crouched in a corner with my spear across my knees and my whole body shaking. The sun rose higher. The arrows kept coming. Men died. By midday it was clear we would not hold. The Turks were patient, content to wait and shoot, knowing we had no water and no relief was coming. A few men made runs for it, trying to reach the sea that lay somewhere to the west. Most were cut down, but some made it, or seemed to, disappearing into the scrub in the distance. I left at dusk, when the light was failing and the Turkish fire had slackened. I crawled through a gap in the wall and ran in a crouch toward a dry stream I had spotted earlier. Behind me the arrows resumed, but they were shooting blind in the gathering dark. I fell into the stream and lay there gasping, certain that any moment a Turkish blade would find me. But no blade came. The sounds of fighting faded. The night filled with the calls of birds and the rustle of wind through dry grass. I lay in that streamed until the moon rose, and then I began crawling west, toward where I hoped the sea lay, toward where the Byzantine ships might still be waiting. Return. It took me 2 days to reach the coast. I have only fragments of memory from that journey. Drinking from a muddy pool and vomiting it back up, hiding in a thorn thicket while Turkish riders passed less than 50 yards away, following a goat path that seemed to lead toward the sound of waves. I lost my spear at some point. I lost my knife when I used it to dig up roots I hoped were edible, and it snapped at the handle. By the time I staggered down to a pebble beach where Byzantine boats were loading refugees, I had lost everything but the clothes on my back and the cross I had sewn there months ago on the Rhine. The Greeks pulled me aboard without ceremony, just another body among the dozens crowded into the boat. No one spoke. We sat in silence as the oars bit the water and carried us back across the straits, back toward Constantinople, back toward the European shore we had left with such hope just weeks before. I do not know how many survived Civitate. I heard later from a Greek officer who spoke a little Latin that perhaps 3,000 made it back from the 6,000 who had marched out. Perhaps fewer. Numbers again lost meaning. Gerard was dead. Mathilde was dead or missing, which amounted to the same thing. Most of the people I had walked beside from the Rhine to this terrible shore were gone. The camp outside Constantinople was subdued when we returned. The word of the disaster had reached ahead of us, carried by earlier refugees, and the mood was no longer one of confidence and crusade, but of fear and doubt. Some said we should turn back, that God had clearly not willed this pilgrimage. Others said we needed to wait for the real army, the knights and princes who would come with proper equipment and discipline. Still others muttered that the Greeks had betrayed us, had sent us into ambush deliberately, that we should never have trusted the emperor or his promises. I did not care about any of it. I sat in the mud outside a tent that belonged to no one I knew, staring at my hands, which were scratched and filthy and trembling. Someone brought me bread, and I could not eat it. Someone asked my name, and I could not remember how to answer. The road from the Rhine had led to this: a beach of bodies, a rout, a shambling return to a camp full of strangers who had lost everything they carried and most of the people they loved. We had marched singing hymns and believing we were righteous. We had died in the dust of Asia, cut down by an enemy we never really saw. And for what? For God's glory? For remission of sins? For the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre, which lay 1,000 miles further than we had managed to reach? I did not know. I did not know anything anymore except that the road had broken me, had ground me down to nothing but breath and pulse and the animal desire to keep living even when living seemed pointless. In the weeks that followed, proper armies began to arrive. Knights in real armor, with destriers and squires and supply trains. Princes and counts with banners that flew from proper poles. They looked at us survivors with a mixture of pity and contempt, and I did not blame them. We had been the vanguard, the first wave, the People's Crusade they would call it later. But we had been little more than a mob, and mobs do not conquer kingdoms or liberate holy cities. Some of the survivors joined the new armies, attaching themselves to lords who would accept them as servants or foot soldiers. Others began the long journey home, begging their way back up the roads we had marched down with such hope. I do not know which I would have chosen if someone had asked me, but no one asked. I simply stayed, part of the crowd that lingered outside the walls of Constantinople, neither fully part of the new crusade nor capable of leaving it behind. I told myself I would see Jerusalem eventually, that the suffering would be redeemed, that some meaning would emerge from the chaos and death. I told myself many things in those days. I believed none of them. The road from the Rhine had taught me that faith alone is not enough, that courage without discipline is just another word for foolishness, that God's will, if such a thing exists, is more terrible and strange than any preacher's sermon could capture. We had set out to do something holy and had achieved only slaughter. We had followed banners and relics and the promise of indulgences, and we had found only arrows and heat and the taste of fear. If there was a lesson in it, I never learned it. If there was glory, I never saw it. There was only the road, and the people who died along it, and the few of us who survived to carry the memory of their names a little further before we too were forgotten. The walls of Constantinople stood unchanged, golden in the morning light, indifferent to the small tragedies played out in their shadow. The road to Jerusalem continued east, waiting for the next wave of pilgrims, the next army, the next group of faithful or foolish or desperate men, willing to believe that suffering might be redeemed by distance and devotion. I sat in the mud and watched the walls and wondered if any of us would ever see the holy city we had been promised, and if we did, whether it would be worth the price we had paid to reach it.